And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is End-Time Newsman, Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. Today's Friday, June 22nd, 2012. Did you see the photograph of the big green Jesus overlooking Rio de Janeiro, Brazil? I posted the photo on TrueNews.com today. The Illuminists are unveiling this week their green religion to replace Christianity. Marc Morano will call into True News in a few minutes with a report from the communist confab underway in Rio. I'm referring to the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, which is nothing more than a repackaging of old communist mumbo-jumbo for implementing the 1848 Communist Manifesto that calls for the abolition of all privately owned property, the abolition of all rights of inheritance, the confiscation of private property, and the centralization of all farming and food production into the hands of the state. So the next time you hear somebody on TV or a college professor or some other talking head talking about sustainable development or global warming or saving the planet, recognize that person is knowingly or unknowingly advancing the long-range plan of the communists to seize control of all private property to bring about their utopian New World Order. Now, another guy attending the UN summit this week who wants to bring on a New World Order is Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. During a news conference in Rio yesterday, Mr. Ahmadinejad said Iran and Syria would unite against the United States and Israel to create a new world order based on belief in Allah. Meanwhile, the New York Times reported that CIA agents are operating secretly in southern Turkey, helping to provide military assistance to Syrian rebels seeking to topple President Assad. The main task is to decide who receives weapons, including automatic rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, ammunition, and anti-tank weapons. The arms are being taken mostly across the Turkish border by what the New York Times calls a shadowy network of intermediaries, including Syria's Muslim Brotherhood. They are said to have been paid for by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. London's Guardian newspaper reported today that Saudi Arabian officials are preparing to pay the salaries of the Free Syria Army as a means of encouraging mass defections from the Syrian military. The move, which has been discussed between Saudi officials and American officials, is believed to be gaining momentum as a recent flush of weapons sent to rebel forces by Saudi Arabia and Qatar start to make an impact in Syria. Officials in the Saudi capital of Riyadh embraced the idea when it was put forth to them by Arab officials in May. The move to pay the rebels' forces centers on paying the Free Syria Army in either U.S. dollars or euros, meaning their salaries would be restored to pre-revolution levels or possibly increased. According to the London newspaper, Joe Lieberman, the Jewish U.S. Senator from Connecticut, is the driving force behind the scheme to encourage the Saudis to pay the salaries of the Syrian rebel soldiers. And the BBC reported that Syria shot down a Turkish warplane over the Mediterranean on Friday, risking a new crisis between the Middle Eastern neighbors already at bitter odds over the 16-month-old revolt against President Assad. Depka file reported that their military sources said that Syrian anti-air defenses shot down the plane in an ambush calculated to retaliate for yesterday's defection of a Syrian Air Force pilot who flew his Russian-built MiG-21 to Jordan to seek asylum. Depka also reported that Syrian President Assad Thursday night ordered his entire Air Force fleet of fighter bombers grounded for fear more pilots might defect. Iran has reportedly detected what it is calling a massive cyber attack on its nuclear facilities, and the country's intelligence minister, Haydar Moslih, believes that the United States, Israel, and Britain are behind the attack. He said, based on the information, America and the Zionist regime, along with the MI6, planned an operation to launch a massive cyber attack against Iran's facilities following the meeting between Iran and the P5+1 in Moscow. Now, the P5+1 is composed of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council conducting talks with Iran on its nuclear program. Security experts said last month that a highly sophisticated computer virus called Flame had infected computers in Iran. Iranian officials were quick to say the country defeated the virus. According to a leading security company, Symantec, the powerful Flame computer virus is not only capable of espionage, but it can also sabotage computer systems and was likely used to attack Iran in April. Iran had previously blamed Flame for causing data loss on computers in the country's main oil export terminal and its oil ministry. But prior to Symantec's discovery, cyber experts had only unearthed evidence that proved Flame could spy on conversations on the computers it infects and steal data. But Symantec researcher Vikram Thakor said yesterday that the company has now identified a component of Flame that allows operators to delete files from computers, which means it can cause critical programs to fail or completely disable operating systems. Mr. Thakor said these guys have the capability to delete everything on the computer. Now, if Symantec's conclusions are validated, that means the Flame virus could be used as a cyber weapon to attack computers that run critical infrastructure systems, including dams, chemical plants, and manufacturing facilities. Russia Today TV reported that another computer worm is secretly stealing blueprints on computers in Latin America. The worm targets a program used by architects, engineers, project managers, and designers to create blueprints for machines, buildings, household appliances, and other inventions. The virus steals the blueprints and sends them to an email account registered, guess where? You got it, China. It's typhoon season in Asia. That means Japan is dead center to be hit by powerful hurricanes over the coming months. The big concern, of course, is the danger posed to the crippled nuclear power plant reactors at Fukushima. Only one of the damaged reactors is covered by a huge polyester shell. Reactors 3 and 4 suffered extensive damage to the buildings that have not been repaired. Should Fukushima receive a direct hit from a typhoon, there is the risk of highly radioactive water escaping the exposed pools of uranium fuel rods or the tanks holding contaminated water. In addition to typhoons, Fukushima also faces the threat of deadly tornadoes. Last month, a powerful tornado ripped through a Japanese city only 106 miles southwest of the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. Nuclear engineering professor Kazuhiko Kudo is concerned that the uranium spent fuel pools number 3 and number 4 are completely exposed. He told Japanese authorities that a tornado with winds of 100 meters per second similar to the one that struck nearby last month, could suck up the radioactive pool water, disperse it over a wide area, and leave the fuel rods fully exposed. There are over 1,500 spent fuel rods in the cooling pool of reactor building number 4. And without cooling water, the rods would heat up and start releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere, which of course would be carried by the high winds from a typhoon or tornado. Pay close attention to this next story from Japan. The Asian country may be moving towards acquiring nuclear weapons. Japan's parliament on Wednesday quietly inserted language in the country's Atomic Energy Act with vague language that declares, quote, contributing to security guarantees as one of the goals of the country's nuclear policy. The new language states that nuclear power is, quote, intended to protect citizens' lives and property, preservation of the environment, and guaranteeing the nation's security, end of quote. News of the change in the law sent shockwaves through Asia on fears that Japan has decided to build an arsenal of nuclear warheads. Now, days before the massive earthquake and tsunami on February 11, 2011, the governor of Tokyo said that China, Russia, and North Korea were enemies of Japan, and that Japan would start producing nuclear bombs by the end of 2011. Within days of making that statement, Japan was hit by the mega earthquake and tsunami. It was later discovered that one of the Fukushima reactors was producing plutonium, a necessary fuel for making atomic bombs. Now, last week, Japan announced that it would resume its plutonium production. Jim Haddock and I speculated on this program in May 2011 that Japan may have been targeted by an earthquake detonator used by Russia or China. Last week, I interviewed British intelligence expert Michael Shrimpton, who told True News that he had been given information from a Russian spy that a nuclear bomb was on board a top-secret German submarine controlled by that country's spy agency, DVD, that the bomb was on its way to Japan for a possible stealth attack on the Fukushima plant. In another case of nuclear nuclear security, Sweden has raised the threat level at its nuclear plants after an explosive device was discovered on a truck entering one of its 3 facilities. Plastic explosives were found on the vehicle as it drove into the reactor area at a nuclear plant south of Gothenburg, Sweden. Now let's take a short break. When I return, Marc Morano will be on the telephone from the UN summit in Brazil with an eyewitness report on the effort to impose Agenda 21 on all nations. You are listening to True News.
You're listening to True News, the end-time newscast. Rick will return after this announcement.
God wants you to know His will, and He'll do whatever it takes to point you in the right direction. Here's today's moment with Charles Stanley.
Well, remember this, that God has a will and a plan for all of our lives. So what does it take for us to be able to listen to God's will and His plan? Sometimes He uses a very restless spirit, because all of us have our routine each day and the things that we're involved in, your family, your work, and the ministry. And so for God to get our attention to move us in a separate direction, or to say something we're not expecting and anticipating, what does He do? He stirs us up on the inside. Then oftentimes it's a spoken word. And I think how many people say to me, I was going about my business, I was at home or in the car, and all of a sudden you said something in the message, one word, one phrase got my attention. And all of a sudden I realized that God was speaking to me. And it was from that moment on, God began to unveil His will to my life. Sometimes it's an unusual blessing. He just blesses us above and beyond what we could expect. Answers prayer, for example, that we didn't even anticipate Him doing so. He knows exactly what it takes to get our attention. On the other hand, sometimes it's unanswered prayer. And because of unanswered prayer, it drives you to do what? To pray more, to seek His face, to turn to Him, and to ask Him, God, what are you trying to say to me? And oftentimes it takes unanswered prayer. God seems to be gone, and then all of a sudden we get real honest with Him about our relationship to Him. And then, of course, sometimes it's disappointment. Disappointment drives us to God, or it will drive us further away from God. And you see, because He wants to show you, allowing these things in your life is God's strong way of saying, I have the best for you. I want to show you my will. My will is best. And even in these difficult times when we suffer defeat sometime, you don't turn away from God. If God has allowed you to suffer defeat, God wants to get your attention. There's something He wants to say to you. He will give you a success in your life, but sometimes you have to walk through the valley of defeat in order to come to the mountain peak of success in your life. And let me just say this to you. I've been a Christian a long time. It's a whole lot simpler to listen to Him, to get in the Word of God and say, Lord, what are you trying to say to me? And surrender your stubborn will to Him, and let Him show you the best way for your life.
The first way all of us must respond to God is by accepting His free offer of forgiveness and eternal life. I hope you'll visit us at intouch.org to learn why it's essential that you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. When you get there, simply click All Things Are New.
You are listening to True News, your alternative source for world news and analysis. I'm Rick Wiles. There's a global convention of circus clowns gathering in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil this week. All of us need to keep an eye on them. Hopefully it will be another expensive talk fest in which nothing is accomplished. I'm talking about the Rio Plus 20 Summit. Officially, it is the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. It is known as Rio Plus 20 because this week's global event is 20 years after the first UN Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio in 1992. Agenda 21 was birthed at that summit. The Agenda 21 platform is being implemented in states and provinces and cities and towns throughout the world. And the goal is to eventually abolish private property rights. Leaders from more than 130 nations are attending the environmental summit. 86 presidents and heads of state are in Rio. But the big boys, Barack Obama, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, and others, are not attending the event. One person who is attending is Canadian communist Maurice Strong. Mr. Strong is a longtime proponent of global governance and a new global economic system. This is the first time the old commie has resurfaced for years after his hands got caught in the cookie jar stealing money during the Iraq food for oil scandal. Mr. Strong endorsed a check for $988,885 made out to a Mr. M. Strong, issued by a Jordanian bank. The check was hand-delivered to Mr. Strong by Tungsten Park, a former South Korean intelligence agent who was convicted in New York federal court of conspiring to bribe UN officials on behalf of Saddam Hussein in connection with the Iraq Oil for Food program. After barely escaping a prison sentence, Maurice Strong fled to Beijing, China, where he has a home. Now, if you go back to the 1980s, Tungsten Park was also connected to another Washington scandal. That one was linked to false messiah Reverend Sung Myung Moon. Mr. Park worked for former South Korean Colonel Bo Hee-pak. The colonel was in charge of Reverend Moon's political operations in the USA. Vast sums of money issued from the Diplomat National Bank in Washington were spread around the nation's capital to a lot of political groups, including some organizations led by very famous Christian leaders. One such person was pre-tribulation rapture fiction writer Tim LaHaye, who received at least $500,000 from Reverend Moon through Tungsten Park. Well, that's another story. Back to Rio and the old Canadian capitalist communist Maurice Strong. There's an important reason why Christians must monitor the shenanigans in Brazil this week. 20 years ago, the UN held its first Earth Summit in Rio. It was led by the communist Maurice Strong, who had the support of the so-called conservative Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. I said that because all this liberal conservative, Tory, Labour, Republican, Democrat stuff is smoke and mirrors. All of these parties in the West are owned and controlled by the Illuminists. Why is it important for Christians to know that Maurice Strong, the 82-year-old godfather of the global green movement, has resurfaced? Mr. Strong is a communist comrade with former Soviet Union dictator Mikhail Gorbachev. The two commies conspired in 1997 to introduce at the 2002 Rio Summit something called the UN Earth Charter. The document was actually carried into the summit in an ornately decorated chest made from sycamore wood. The chest was called the Ark of Hope, and it was designed to look like the Ark of the Covenant. Both Communist Gorbachev and Communist Strong proudly proclaimed the Earth Charter to be the world's new 10 Commandments. Mr. Strong said, quote, "The real goal of the Earth Charter is that it will, in fact, become like the 10 Commandments," end of quote. And Mr. Gorbachev told the Los Angeles Times on May 8, 1997, quote, "Do not do unto the environment of others what you do not want done to your own environment. My hope is that this charter will be a kind of 10 Commandments, a Sermon on the Mount that provides a guide for human behavior toward the environment in the next century," end of quote. You can see the blasphemous Ark of Hope on its website, arkofhope.com. Clearly, it was designed to look like the biblical Ark of the Covenant. The Ark is presently stored at the Shelburne Farms in Vermont, USA. In addition to the Earth Charter, the so-called New 10 Commandments, the New Agers also place books and earth mass into the vessels, denoting a magic circle where special rules and energies apply. Now, during the run-up to the 2002 UN Summit, Maurice Strong's New Age wife held a 3-week vigil with a group called Wisdom Keepers, who describe themselves as global transformationalists. 24 hours each day, Mrs. Strong and her band of Gaia witches and warlocks meditated, burned sacred fires, and beat drums to help hold the energy pattern in place during the UN Summit. And during that 1992 summit, Mr. Strong said, quote, "It is the responsibility of each human being today to choose between the force of darkness and the force of light," end of quote. Now, the term force of darkness and force of light are straight out of the pages of the writings of Madame Helena Blavatsky, a dark, evil witch born in Ukraine in 1831. She was a student and teacher of Babylonian secret knowledge. She founded the Theosophical Society, a satanic organization that she called the Universal Brotherhood of Humanity, that was charged with the task of teaching the secret doctrine to people around the world. Whenever Madame Blavatsky spoke of the force of darkness and the force of light, she was referring to God and Satan. She taught that Christianity was the force of darkness and that Lucifer was the force of light. Now, I urge all Christians around the world to immediately pray and intercede to God that He will confound and confuse the participants of this UN summit in Rio. Christians are connected to the real source of power in the universe, And we ought to aggressively pray against these pagan assemblies that are seeking to establish a world religion based on the worship of Mother Earth or the Gaia goddess. I gave you this little lesson today because it is vitally important that we know the players, the agenda, and the strategies of the globalists. And it's important that we comprehend the spiritual dimension of their activities. Well, Mr. Marc Morano is in Rio de Janeiro to observe the New Age circus. Marc does an awesome job monitoring the global green movement. His website is climatedepot.com. Marc, have you seen Maurice Strong yet?
I have not seen him, although we've heard he's here. He's making the rounds. This is the godfather of the UN Green Movement, the man who presided over the first Earth Summit in 1992. He can't be overly happy because this is definitely a depressed meeting going on right now. There's no big world leaders here. President Obama opted not to go. There's not much momentum, but he's got to be overall proud of the entire UN process because he's got all these countries essentially conned into doing it. But he's here presiding over it, keeping a watchful eye, and he's the man, which I'm sure your listeners know, who's the original global governance guy, the guy that wants the UN to be in charge with global taxes, global CO2 taxes, global monitoring, global governance from all countries, that we can have an international agency that they'd be in charge of that controls our development. And that's still what they're trying to achieve.
Marc, I was surprised when I read that Maurice Strong was there because he's been in hiding since, he was implicated in the Iraq oil for food program scandal. And, after he was caught cashing a check for almost $1 million, he escaped prison sentence, but he fled to Beijing. And he's really kept a low profile for a number of years. So I was really surprised that they brought him out for this summit.
Yes, he came out. He said that he didn't flee to China, that was just merely a coincidence that all came out at that time and he moved to China. But yeah, you're right. I don't know if Interpol has a APB out for him, if he's going to be arrested or not, but he's here and he's making public appearances.
Okay, I heard we saw the photograph, the amazing photograph of the giant Christ the Redeemer statue on the mountain overlooking the city. It's bathed in green light. Have you seen this?
Yes, you can't miss it. Anywhere you are in the city of Rio, whether you're on the beaches or walking the streets, you see this gigantic eco-Christ, if you will, staring down at you. And they've now, you can say Christ turns green, and that implies he's environmentalist. It also implies his stomach turning. What they've done, and this is what James Lovelock, the green guru of the UK, who recently is now recanting not only his climate position, but basically his environmental positions. He's now pro-fracking. He's anti-wind power. He's anti-renewable. He's basically, and the other thing he said last week to the UK Guardian was the green religion is taking over from the Christian religion, unquote. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with this eco-Christ hovering over the city. And at Climate Depot, I have a picture of the green Christ looking down, the environmentally friendly Christ, if you will. The
green religion is taking over from the Christian religion. It's a very interesting quote.
Yeah, James Lovelock said this. He is the godfather of the entire environmental movement. He came up with the Gaia Earth theory, that the Earth is a living, breathing organism. This was used by many people to worship Mother Earth. He was a hero to the environmental left. And now, in 2006, he had said there was going to be a few breeding couples left in the Arctic because global warming was going to be so bad, the Arctic would be the only place cool enough. He's now recanted, said we don't have the physics worked out. We thought we knew what we were talking about. He calls himself an independent scientist. He's reversed himself. He bought a seaside home. He laughs about sea level, doesn't think there's going to be much sea level rise. This is a huge coup for scientific reality and the skeptics. And, of course, most of the media is ignoring this, but I do give credit to the UK Guardian for reporting this and for MSNBC, of all places, for initially reporting it.
What is the strangest thing that you've seen or heard so far while you've been in Rio?
Well, probably the most wacky thing I've heard was today. we had a press conference at 10:30, and lo and behold, keeping us from our press conference was none other than Xena, Princess Warrior of the old show from the 90s, Lucy Lawless, and Richard Branson, the owner of Virgin Atlantic. And there was Richard Branson campaigning against oil drilling, and particularly oil drilling in the Arctic, saying that he wished he could, his 3 airline companies, his space company, and other companies, he wished he could find another fuel besides oil in carbon-based energy to do it, but he can't right now. But meanwhile, he's teaming with Greenpeace to try to prevent as much drilling as possible. And the most shocking thing he said is he was praising these small island nations for trying to go carbon neutral and keep their carbon emissions low. And that I found extremely offensive, because here's Richard Branson, who's living the life, jetting around the world, making untold millions off of his carbon-based energy airline company, and he's praising people at barely a subsistence lifestyle for keeping themselves poor and keeping themselves primitive and keeping themselves simple, as though they're doing it right, when he himself will not give up his modern carbon bombed lifestyle. I'm trying to think of the best phrase to describe it. Carbon belching lifestyle, if you will, that Richard Branson is. So I found that offensive, that he's praising primitive people that are barely at subsistence level for not using too much carbon, while he himself is profiting immensely from it.
Well, there's nothing funnier, more hilarious than a left-wing hypocrite.
Yeah.
and we see it all the time.
We also, the actor Ed Norton has been down here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And also I saw David Suzuki, the Canadian, their Canadian Al Gore, if you will. He was here. They're all, going to be here today and tomorrow. It's a 3-day conference. It ends tomorrow, or probably go into Saturday. But this is, 20 years ago, we had Jane Fonda, Woody Harrelson. You had then President George H.W. Bush, who showed up. He was shamed into coming. Al Gore shamed him into coming. Bill Clinton shamed him into coming in 1992. And this year, Al Gore's nowhere to be found. This year, no world leaders, no UK government. Most of the European leaders aren't even here. No, there's no congressional staff here. The only people coming is Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and the climate envoy of the United States, a guy named Todd Stern. This is a very low-level event. I challenge the Greenpeace, the environmental activists, and the media here to ask Hillary Clinton why she's conning them. Why are they acting as though the United States is actively involved? That the United States wants nothing to do with this conference, particularly in an election year, because it is such utter nonsense going on down here, talking about the rights of Mother Earth, international criminal courts for climate justice, sustainable development, which means gender equality or whatever you want it to mean. It's, and the James Lovelock, who I talked about earlier, the environmentalist, he says that this is the Sustainable Development Conference. He says it's meaningless drivel. And essentially it's development that the UN approves, that's sustainable, that makes the Earth, it's Earth-friendly development. And that can be defined in any way that anyone chooses at any time, in any circumstance, as long as it suits their ends. And it's a very dangerous concept, because they're going after global governance of development. And with the species and biodiversity, what they're doing at this conference, they're looking at ways to regulate shipping lanes, fisheries, transportation, agriculture, forestry, land use, you name it. They're looking to control every aspect of human development. And it's very scary when you hear them talk, because they think there are, billions of too many people on this earth. So they're implying that we've got to get rid of people somehow, some way. And they're also talking about how nations like the United States are doing it all wrong, and that we have to be essentially stopped, and we can't allow the developing world to develop like we did. I interviewed Jerry Brown, the governor of California, at the last Earth Summit. I was in Johannesburg, South Africa for that. And yes, I am willing to travel to exotic locations to follow the United Nations at these conferences. I went to Bali. I went to Cancun. That is the cross I will bear to report on these. But okay, I'm being a little silly there. But essentially, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, said that the developing world can't emulate our development. They can't make the same mistakes we did. And there you see the heart of this movement. It's white, wealthy Westerners telling people of color, 1.5 billion of them who don't have running water and electricity, how to develop making them get solar panels on huts made of dung because they're not allowed to have coal plants and natural gas and infrastructure and running water and electricity because they can't make, quote, the same mistakes we did. It's immoral. It's unethical. I challenged the delegates here when I spoke that they should redefine sustainable development as oil, gas, coal, because that is what sustained human endeavor. It's been one of the greatest liberators of mankind in the history of our planet, giving us longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality, modern hospitals, dentistry, you name it. It has unleashed human potential, carbon-based energy. And so I've been having a lot of fun there with that.
I bet you have, by spreading that message. Mark, do you have an estimate of how much money has been spent on the circus?
Oh my God, there's about 45,000 people estimated here. I just came from Durban in December at the last UN climate conference, and that was probably another 15 to 20,000. Years ago in Copenhagen, they probably had 40,000. I mean, these are just it's a huge bureaucratic party. The one thing the United Nations knows how to do is spend money. And once they do this, then that's just money for the conferences. But now they're trying to get like $100 billion climate fund, which the United States has committed to. They're talking about global CO2 taxes. They talk about that every time. And they talk about all other sorts of funding and just utter nonsense. Of course, you have the UN IPCC reports, which the United States contributes to in the millions of dollars. You have this new biodiversity panel modeled after the climate panel, which is now going to come out and just give us politicized utter nonsense about species extinction. And they'll claim 50,000 species are going extinct a year, but they can't name a single species. And when they're pressed on it, they admit that it's things that are they're merely computer models of species that may exist, that may be going extinct, but they can't name them. And they even go further and say that these are actually essentially amoebas and bacteria that they're talking about, not even the mammalian or reptilian or other kinds of species that you could identify with in a way when they use that phrase. So it's just utter nonsense now. They've started this. I've got the former founding member of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore, who wrote a special piece for Climate Depot. I did an interview with him, and he is disgusted with the modern environmental movement, and he talks all about the species nonsense, which the United Nations is now claiming. And by the way, this is important. They are now claiming that species is a larger problem than global warming. Global warming has been thrown under the bus. It's been demoted. Global warming won't go away as an issue, but it's going to be rolled into this larger issue of biodiversity, sustainable development, species extinction. And the UN itself is saying that saving species is now a more urgent problem than global warming. So this is a shocking development. Old eco scares don't die. They just sort of fade away and roll into the next one. And there's even talk of resurrecting the old overpopulation scare, which has been thoroughly and totally discredited since Paul Ehrlich first came out with that book, The Population Bomb, in the 1960s.
So they're giving up on the global warming tactic.
Well, I don't want to use the phrase giving up. They're demoting it. It's still going to be around, but I think they realize that the public has given up on it. Two new polls are just shocking. Back in 2006 and 2007, you had the United Nations, the news media, and Al Gore claiming that global warming was the greatest threat facing humanity among all issues, greater than terrorism, war, economics, healthcare, you name it. Well, it turns out, new Gallup poll from March and April, and one in Canada as well, shows that among environmental issues, global warming is dead last. So we've gone from people claiming it was the number one issue of all time to it's not even the number one environmental problem. And the United Nations realizes that after hundreds of billions of dollars, after news media reports, after foundations, after United Nations reports, after Oscars, after Nobel Prizes, the public could not show less concern for global warming, ranking it dead last among environmental issues behind deforestation, clean air, clean water, etc. So they realize a dead horse. So what they're trying to do is they can't just walk away, but they're demoting it, rolling it into the larger issue. It's still going to be talked about, but they're trying to shift the emphasis now on sustainable development and worry over species extinction, which, as I mentioned, it gives them much more control over all aspects of human endeavors, including, as I mentioned, waterways, transportation, land use, property rights. They can now justify any and all actions in order to save the earth.
Mark, you said earlier that there's a depressed atmosphere over the conference, and that's a good sign. What do you think accounts for this lack of enthusiasm? Is it the realization that that all that they did to promote global warming failed and they've got to start over, or is it the meltdown of the global financial system, and they know that it's becoming more difficult to come up with the money to fund these schemes? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the global financial meltdown had an impact, but you have to understand that long before that, global warming was on its dying legs. And in fact, you can go back to 2000, I believe it was 2009, 2008, where Gallup data showed more people believed in man-made global warming, than haunted houses than man-made global warming, 37 to 36%. And this was pre-ClimateGate. The movement was already facing, and it was a victim of its own excesses, of its alarmism, of its fear-mongering. But chiefly it was a victim of using the UN as a source of science and Al Gore as your frontman. The UN is a distrusted, scandal-ridden institution which the American public was never going to accept. And Al Gore as your frontman, love him or hate him, you don't get a polarizing political figure as the leader of this alleged nonpartisan movement. So they were doomed from the start. In terms of why the Earth Summit and just environmentalism, I think what's happened is no one's buying the United Nations process anymore. It's a big joke. I mean, year after year they have these meetings and they claim success in meetings, and then the next year they start all over and they have all these verbal non-binding agreements, and the more they try to have any impact on anything, nothing changes in terms of the countries doing it. There's really no environmental lasting treaties that come out of this. It just becomes a big noise fest. There's fatigue. I think regardless of the economics of the world right now, I don't see this being resurrected anytime soon. I don't see any major agreements coming out. They're saying the UN climate treaty process is probably dead until the year 2020. I mean, there's just no interest in it. And the world's changing. 20 years ago, you could point to the United States as the big boogeyman, but now you have China and India, surpassing emissions of the United States, and they're the ones that China's building, I can't remember the number if it's accurate, 2 or 3 coal plants a week. They're the ones that the world is at, and China's not about to hinder their development. India has told the United Nations point blank they will not sign on to a development limiting climate treaty when 40% of their residents don't have running water and electricity. So it becomes a silly issue. And what ends up happening is the United Nations then just tries to focus on wealthy nations. And because of that, this whole process collapses, because now we have developed nations versus developing nations. The United Nations trying to divide everyone and take money from the wealth. It becomes a redistribution scheme. And we actually had a man named Edenhofer admit that climate policy was really just economic redistribution schemes. It's not about the climate. And so people recognize that. The public doesn't support it. And this whole thing is collapsing.
A global redistribution of wealth from developed nations into the poor nations. It's just another version of socialism. Marc Morano giving us an eyewitness report from the UN conference in Rio de Janeiro. Marc's website, climatedepot.com. Marc, thank you. Appreciate you coming by True News.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ, you're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast.
This is Max McLean. How does God protect those he loves? Listen to the Bible from Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find a refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. From Psalm 91. Listen to the Bible. It's great for the soul.
To hear more, go to radiobible.org.
Well, welcome back to segment 3 of True News for Friday, June 22nd, 2012. I'm Rick Wiles. True News is your alternative source for world news and analysis. We've been on the air since 1999, reporting the true news, not the fake news. And this program is 100% listener supported. Now, we're in the final days of the month of June, and that means we need our partners around the world to send their monthly donation to True News by the end of next week. Now, let me say this. I really admire the True News supporters who faithfully give generous gifts in a time of great financial turbulence in the world. That says a lot about your faith in God and the steadfastness of your character. And Susan and I want you to know that we manage this international ministry as frugally as possible. We don't waste a dollar. That's why this ministry operates in the black month after month, regardless of what is happening in the world. It's a real testimony to others that True News is financially sound, and we are very grateful for the generous support of our audience. If you are a new listener, we invite you to make a commitment to support True News every month throughout 2012. And if you've been listening to True News for a long time, but have never supported the program for whatever reason, please take a step of faith and make that commitment too. You can send your gift online, in the postal mail, or by telephone. To give electronically, online, go to truenews.com, TRUNEWS, truenews.com. Click on Donate. If you use PayPal, type in support@truenews.com as the address to receive the gift. Again, at PayPal, it is support@truenews.com. If you want to call to give your credit card or debit card number over the telephone, our office number, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, is 772-569-8880. Again, 772-569-8880. And if you desire to send a check or money order, please address it to True News, Post Office Box 690069, P.O. Box 690069 in Vero Beach, Florida, the zip code 32969. P.O. Box 690069, Vero Beach, Florida, 32969. Remember, it's important that we receive your donation by the end of next week so that True News can close out the month of June with all invoices and expenses paid. And some of those expenses each month are very large. We broadcast daily on 3 international shortwave radio stations. We transmit the program twice per day on Galaxy 19 satellite across North America and Central America. We're on Blog Talk Radio. We update the news headlines every weekday at TrueNews.com. And, of course, we have our administrative costs of operating our headquarters and employing a staff of employees. We do it all by faith every day, trusting that the funds will arrive. And they always do. We give God all the praise and the glory for His faithfulness, and we thank you from the bottom of our heart for caring for this ministry and standing with us in a time when the whole world seems to be coming apart. In the remaining minutes of today's program, I want to give you a quick update on the latest developments in the worsening global depression. Several weeks ago, I told you that 15 of the world's biggest banks were in shaky condition and could suffer a credit downgrade any day. It happened late yesterday. Moody's Investor Services downgraded Goldman Sachs, Barclays, Citigroup, Credit Suisse, HSBC, Royal Bank of Canada, the Bank of America, UBS, JP Morgan Chase, Credit Agricole, Royal Bank of Scotland, Societe Generale, and BNP Paribas. The credit downgrade will add to the bank's borrowing costs and increase pressure for additional capitalization. Moody's Global Banking Manager Director Greg Bauer said, quote, all of the banks affected by today's actions have significant exposure to the volatility and risk of outsized losses inherent to capital markets activities, end of quote. And Mark Grant, managing director at Southwest Security, said, quote, the biggest surprise is the 3-notch downgrade of Credit Suisse, which no one was looking for, end of quote. London's Guardian newspaper reported today that Italy's Prime Minister, Mario Monti, warned of an apocalyptic consequence of failure at next week's summit of EU leaders, outlining a potential death spiral that could threaten the future of Europe. The Italian leader made his remarks before an emergency meeting with Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, French President François Hollande, and Spain's Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy. Now, the Italian Prime Minister said that there is only 1 week remaining for European leaders to save the euro currency. 1 week is what he said. More trouble for the EU bailout scheme. Germany's highest court asked the country's president to delay ratification of the permanent euro bailout fund called the European Stability Mechanism. If he complies, the move would delay the implementation of the bailout by several weeks, another setback for the EU leaders. Nigel Farage, British member of the European Parliament, told King World News today that extreme measures, including repression, will be imposed in Europe very soon. This is what he said, quote, what you may see is a very desperate European Union begin to put in place capital controls and things like this. In a sense, the proposal that is on the table next week, which is coming from Van Rompuy and Barroso, would be the first step toward that repression. Nigel Farage also warned, quote, there were many people that thought communism would fall many years before it did because it was such a total failure. But they managed through repression to keep the whole thing together. What you may see is a very desperate European Union begin to put in place capital controls. Now, he went on to say, frankly, the only way they can win now, the only way that they can win is to take away from the citizens the ability through the ballot box to do anything about it. He said they are hell-bent on doing it, but they know the electorates in the north of Europe are, with every passing day, beginning to realize their little scheme, and we know the markets have no confidence in them. When asked about gold, Nigel Farage said, quote, given the mess that we're in, and given this threat that we could possibly be facing a 1931 type movement, you have to be in this market, got to be long gold, no question about it. Again, comments by Nigel Farage, member of the British Parliament and a frequent guest here on True News. Hey, I think it was yesterday I posted on True News an article from USA Today newspaper about developments at Love Field Airport in Dallas, Texas. This is supposedly the airport of the future, or I should say what airport security is going to look like. This is what USA Today said. At a terminal being renovated at Love Field, contractors are installing 500 high-definition security cameras sharp enough to read an auto license plate or a logo on a shirt. The cameras capable of tracking airline passengers from the parking garage to the gates to the tarmac are a key first step in creating what the airline industry would like to see at airports worldwide, a security apparatus that would scrutinize passengers more thoroughly but less intrusively. It's part of what the International Air Transport Association, which represents the airlines, calls the checkpoint of the future. The goal is for flyers to move almost non-stop through security from the curb to the gate, in contrast to repeated security stops and log jams at checkpoints. USA Today said after checking their luggage, passengers would identify themselves not with driver's licenses and boarding passes, but by scanning fingerprints or irises to prove that they have an electronic ticket. Passengers would walk with their carry-ons through a screening tunnel where they'd undergo electronic scrutiny, replacing what happens now at different stops as they are scanned for metal objects, non-metallic items, and explosives. Went on to say passengers would no longer have to empty carry-ons of liquids and laptops before putting them on a conveyor belts for X-ray scans. They could keep their belts on and their shoes on. They could avoid a backlog at full-body scanners. If screeners notice anything suspicious, a passenger would still be pulled aside and patted down. The changing technology, combined with new screening tactics at airports, could make the checkpoint of the future a reality, airline officials say. Now, it went on to say the key to speeding up checkpoints and making security less intrusive will be to identify and assess travelers according to the risk they pose to safety in the skies. I want to point out this line, making security less intrusive. Listen, this is another example of a technique that I have seen in operation for many, many years. If you don't know this technique, please burn it into your head, and you will see it used over and over and over on the general public. Here's the way it works. It is first to create a crisis, create a problem, and then anticipate the reaction of the public, and then offer the public the desired solution. It is crisis, reaction, solution. Crisis, reaction, solution. Problem, reaction, solution. So here's what they've done. They have deliberately created a crisis of security at airports. They have deliberately made it extremely uncomfortable to go through security checkpoints at airports. They've done everything that they can to offend people. They've got the TSA groping you. They've got the security pat-downs. They've made it a horrible experience to go through the airports. Why? Because they know the reaction they'll get from the public. And then what? They will offer the public their desired solution, which is Big Brother surveillance. And what they'll say to the public is, we hear you. We know you don't want to be scanned. We know you don't want to be patted down. We know you don't want TSA agents putting their hands in your children's pants. Yes, we heard you. So we have a solution. Put your eyes up to the glass and let us scan your iris. Put your hands on the scanners. Let us scan your hands. Walk through this tunnel and let the cameras check you over. This is the desired solution. This is what they planned all along. It is problem, reaction, solution. Problem, reaction, solution. They're doing the same thing with the illegal immigration. They've allowed it to go on and on and on for years and years and years. Why? Because they know the reaction of the public. The public will be demanding a solution. What will be the solution? Biometric ID cards. Watch what they do. And once you catch this scenario, problem, reaction, solution, you'll see it in operation over and over and over as they move the general public like cattle down the line into the corral. Well, that's it for today's edition of True News. We appreciate you listening. Hope you listened all week. I'm Rick Wiles. We will see you on Monday. We've got a great lineup of guests all next week right here in True News. We love you. See you next week.